Now, while the RBA is keeping rates on hold, new board minutes reveal there are strong arguments for further hikes. We're going to bring in now the host of Business Now and Sky News. And of course, this is on right before my show every day at 4:30, and I recommend you tuning in for it. Let's bring in Ross Greenwood. Ross, great to see you. What do the RBA board minutes show about how the governor and the board is thinking about rates for the rest of this year and next?
Effectively, Shari, it shows that the board is really torn in some ways as to its fight on inflation. Remember when a couple of weeks ago it put interest rates on hold? It was the first of the major central banks in the Western world to do that. It was also the very first to, if you like, taper down last November interest rate rises from 0.5% to 0.25%. It was the last central bank to start raising rates in the face of the rising inflation. So in many ways, the actions of the Reserve Bank have been, in many ways, what they call dovish. In other words, they've been softer than many of the other central banks around the world, in particular compared with, say, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve in the United States, and the Bank of New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. So these minutes still show that they are concerned about inflation, and they've got good right to be. Oil prices have jumped from $70 to $85 a barrel in the past month. You've had an outbreak of public sector wages that seem to be coming down the track. And on top of that, you've still got other forms of inflation that'll come and hit Australians. And not the least of this is going to be even the very low Australian dollar, which means imported goods become more expensive. But you can still see here, money markets say next month they expect that the interest rates overwhelmingly are likely to be still on hold at that time as well.
Now, Ross, we're getting very close to hearing the detail from Treasurer Jim Chalmers about the review into how the RBA operates. He has flagged major changes. Have a quick look.
There are some recommendations which would require legislative change. There are some that would require the governor and the board to change the way that they go about things at the bank. There are some pieces of it which will factor into the statement of conduct of monetary policy.
There's 51 recommendations, Ross, near 300-page report. What changes are you expecting to see about how the RBA board operates?
Well, the hint that the Treasurer gives you there is about the legislative change. The Reserve Bank Act goes back to 1959, and the important aspect of this is it is the board's responsibility to make those interest rate decisions right now. But there have been central banks in other parts of the world where you have a separate monetary policy committee. Now, who is on that monetary policy committee might also be the subject of some recommendations and debate as well. But then you have the board that really looks after the functions of the Reserve Bank. Then you have the Monetary Policy Committee who will have specialists on it to determine it. One of the problems of the Reserve Bank and the errors that they have made is clearly not recognising the inflation threat early enough, and indeed not really being, if you like, beholden to their inflation target. It's been a loose target, not a really firm target for the Reserve Bank over a period of time. This led to conversations like we won't be raising interest rates until 2024, which was a misstep of communications. One other thing about communications is it seems highly likely the Reserve Bank will hold a media conference after every one of its interest rate decisions to explain itself, which it should do, because part of the problem of the Reserve Bank is it has really not been open enough about the debate that's going on inside so that we can understand that debate and make our own decisions as to how we think interest rates might move into the future. These are some of the things I'd suggest that will come out of this review.
It's going to be fascinating because we heard the Treasurer say that to pass some of these changes, he will need bipartisan support. Some of them will be legislative changes, and it should be, right? You do need bipartisan support when you're making such major changes to an independent institution, which the RBA is. Do you think the coalition does have an appetite to work with the government on this?
Oh, I think it does. And part of the reason for that is because Jim Chalmers has opened up to the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, much of the information and indeed access to this review committee as well, right the way through. What he said yesterday was instructive to me. He does not want this to be sorted out as a political fight in the Senate. He would prefer to have the bipartisan agreement, because once you start to get the Greens involved, once you start to get independent senators involved, who knows where this process should come from. The Reserve Bank should be independent of politics. And the reason for that is the political instinct of a politician right now would be to keep interest rates on hold, not to raise them in the face of inflation, because that would be the politically expedient thing to do. It may not, however, be the right thing to do. And that's why at every step we must remember, regardless of whether we criticise the Reserve Bank or not, the independence of that Reserve Bank must remain absolutely sacrosanct.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Ross Greenwood, while I've got you here, you're the smartest man on the economy, so I've got to ask you about how the broader economy is looking. The financial powerhouse Deloitte has warned the Treasurer that the Australian economy is currently on a knife edge, facing the toughest non-COVID economic outlook since the last recession. Do you share this pessimistic view?
Look, I must admit I do, although Australia right now, if we're sitting here right now, is coping brilliantly. And that is largely because the unemployment rate is at 3.5%. And so people are managing. And even though there's some suggestion of Australians having to dip into their savings to be able to survive and manage these rising costs like power prices and many other costs that are rising, grocery prices as well, the reality is if people did not have a job, in past recessions and downturns, the unemployment rate rose vigorously. And so as a result, people did not have jobs. So they didn't have anything to dip into. They had to fend for themselves with the government. In this particular case, people do have jobs, and that is the one saviour for Australia's economy. But what Deloitte also says is it believes the Reserve Bank should have stopped raising interest rates last year. And in fact, the 2 interest rate rises it's actually had this year almost do tip Australia into a more serious downturn. Now, whether we go to recession or not, that remains to be seen. It's probably unlikely. But there certainly is a downturn coming, really, when these interest rate rises start to bite, along with the higher prices that Australians are having to face right now.
All right, Ross Greenwood, always love having you on the show and hearing your insights. And again, for viewers, he's on every day before my show at 4:30. Thanks so much for your time, Ross.
Good on you, Sherry.